Hi, everybody. I hope you are doing good. My name is Ashley Jones, and I am the author of A Feminist Queer Adventure Line, which was just recently published through LSU Press. And I'm really happy and excited to be here today to chat with you about this book. This was a long process for me to write this, and I'm really glad it's out in the world now. So you lovely folks can hopefully read it. Um, so I've just been told to talk about the book for a little while, which is what I'm going to do. And then we'll open it up for Q&A towards the end. If you do have any questions, I'll be able to answer those. So this book grew out of my dissertation research, to be honest, and then over the last couple of years did some shifts to more closely match what was going on within the game studies discipline and realm. So what I have done through this is essentially the topic is exploring the relationship between game structures, things that are built into a digital game, and the players that play those digital games, and how essentially we're looking at how the messaging of a game, even if it's not explicit messaging, to see what kind of critical thinking skills can be employed while we play digital games. And this again has grown out of, a rise in serious games, in a rise of games that speak to social issues and cultural problems and different cultures and all that kind of stuff. So that that's kind of what drew my inspiration towards this. So specifically within this game, I explore different procedures and mechanics to see how they might invite that critical thinking process from the players themselves. And I expand this out to not just look at specific game structures, but to also look at the cozy gaming genre and the concept of metagaming. So that's a really broad overview of what the book does, of what I attempt to do with that book. So some more details on this is I use Gerald Farkas from the book Playing Dystopia. He comes up with a framework called the video game narrative framework. And what I've done is I've modified that to be more inclusive to not just dystopian genre, but more to game mechanics and procedures or game structures overall, generally. So I modified that to be able to see where gamer input into a situation within that digital game, for example, a stealth run or having to complete an objective to move on to the next mission, or even something as simple as dialogue choices. What the framework now does with how I've reimagined it is to examine those game structures and how they can incite, hopefully, some critical thinking. So the biggest things that I pull over from the framework are concepts and names, definitions, essentially. So we have the implied player, which is a player that it's the game structure itself. It's the blanks and the gaps of a game that a player has to insert themselves into. So the implied player are the guidelines of the game. Complete this mission to move to that mission. There's an invisible wall on this side because we can't have you going over there yet, but you can go this way. That's what I mean by built-in game structures is essentially the guiding principles within a game that tell you what to do and potentially how to do it. And then there's the empirical player. The empirical player is the physical world player, you or me jumping in and being able to experience that situation or that specific circumstance within a digital game just simply by playing it, whether that's through a computer or a console or on our mobile phones or something like that. We use an apparatus to engage with the game. And then we have what will hopefully become the emancipated player, which is an empirical player that has gone through that critical thinking process and become emancipated and is able to see the larger image of, critically what's going on in this situation that they could potentially apply to their own world. So the goal is essentially the emancipated player that's coming about that. And what Farka argues is that we all start out as an empirical player. But once we start recognizing situations or dialogue or circumstances within digital games that we also see in our real lives, that triggers something in us called the player aesthetic response. That makes us wonder, if I can do that here, can I do it over here? Or if I can see that situation in my real life, maybe I should respond to it in the same way in my digital life too, when we are acting as players. So the way that I do that in this book is by pulling out specific structures and specific procedures and mechanics to examine in more detail. And the first one that I do that in is chapter 2, where I talk about embodiment and empathy through the game Life is Strange 2, an Untitled Goose game. And essentially what I do in this chapter is I analyze how in Life is Strange 2, for example, the game requires you to embody a brown body, which is in direct violation of what a lot of AAA game companies assume is their player, which has been looked at and well documented by a lot of folks. But specifically, I pulled from Shira Chess's work on Player 1 and Player 2. So Player 1 is that assumed identity of what a typical gamer is, particularly in Western countries where it's a white, male, able-bodied, middle to upper class, pretty privileged individual. And Player 2 is almost everybody else. So what's interesting about Life is Strange 2 is they ask you to step away from that Player 1 persona, and you literally embody a young teenage man who is of Mexican descent. And so when you're making decisions, when you're responding to dialogue and things like that, you have to embody that young man's life. And that becomes really, really apparent when you start that game and you're stuck in a police brutality situation, an overreaction by police. And then you see that continued throughout that young man's treatment as he attempts to get his little brother to safety. And I point out a couple of different situations there in that book or in that chapter that requires you to not be Player 1 in order to fully understand what's happening in that young man's life. So that's one of the more feminist examples of work that I do with the specific structure of embodiment and how a game attempts to pull empathy from the player. And that empathy is hopefully the critical response that's needed to make you kind of question, maybe I need to pay attention to how I'm responding in certain situations to different types of individuals, because we all have different lived experiences and we come from different backgrounds, and we can't fully understand what other people are going through without our own experiences. So this gives one experience that potentially might not be ours to begin with. So chapter 3 is the next chapter, and this is where I turn a little bit more towards the queer studies side of things. And it examines failure. And specifically, it examines failure as a way of being in the world that is not considered quote unquote normal, but is actually it's just a different way of being in the world that isn't as widely accepted. So I do that through the game, The Stanley Parable. And if you played The Stanley Parable, you know that there's lots of different choices you can make in that game. Some of them lead to the same ending. A lot of them don't lead to the same ending. There's lots of different ending options. And ending is used here quite loosely because it'll just restart you back at the beginning of the game once you get a quote unquote ending. But the premise of that game is that you don't follow directions, or if you do, you get one specific ending. But it's a lot more exciting to not follow the directions of the narrator of that game, to see what happens if you go left instead of right, if you go up instead of down, if you decide to turn around at any given point and go through different doors or into the broom closet, or what have you. And the narrator gets so upset with you with not following directions that it literally paints a line for you to follow. But the more you don't follow that line, the wonkier it ends up getting. And it's a really meta game. It makes you question about, how do we know what game structures are within the game? So by failing, we actually succeed in the Stanley Parable, which puts failure away from, what we consider the heteronormative example of success, which is following the rules and doing what they tell you and all of that kind of stuff. And instead, what we're focused on is doing things our own way, or the way that feels better to us, even if it goes against the mainstream understanding of what success should look like, and failure ending up being a form of success, which is a queer way of thinking that gets used as one of those themes throughout queer studies, and especially queer gaming studies work. And that leads into chapter 4, which I think is one of my favorite games ever and one of my favorite chapters. This is on What Remains of Edith Finch. If you haven't played it, it is excellent. It's quite easy to play. It's not something that you need to know a million buttons for, which I appreciate. But What Remains in Edith Finch is about a young woman's story of how death haunts her family. And the people in her family have died from very tragic, unexpected death, early death, a lot of times too. And sometimes that includes disappearing, sometimes that includes accidents, sometimes that includes, things we can't account for, like being killed and that kind of stuff. But what's interesting, and this is a little bit of a spoiler, I will tell you, is that Edith, who we assume is the main character, is narrating this story and is telling us the story of all the different deaths that have happened in her family by walking through the family home and everybody's rooms that were in the family home. And at the end, what we end up finding out is that this is all a story that's being told to her son, or I guess I shouldn't say son, her child, because she died in childbirth. So she wanted him to have this story because there was nobody else left. So essentially what we do with this specific analysis, what I do with this specific analysis, is that we take a queer approach to death, and we don't view death as an ending per se. We mess with queer time and we embrace it. And, death is just an experience that continues the moment on and on and on of lives and of the people that are involved. Just because, Edith's father passed away or her great uncle passed away or things like that, that doesn't mean that their story ended. That's why Edith is telling the story to their child. And same thing with her story. We end up finding out that story gets told through what Edith left their child. And so I think it's a really interesting analysis of how we can use how death is experienced in that game, because it can be very traumatic at certain points as you live through each of these deaths. It's a game about a series of deaths that you experience. As you live through each of these deaths, death is not signaled ever as an ending. It's signaled as just they no longer exist in the plane that you and I know them in. Now they exist in stories. Now they exist in spirits. Now they exist in our memories. So it invites a lot of questions about, the form of memory, the function of memory, the societal understandings of death, and, what we're told, what it is and what it isn't, and all that kind of stuff. So that's the end of like the specific analyses that I do here. And then in chapter 5, I expand this out to look at the cozy gaming genre that has exploded under that label in the last like 5 years or so. And I look specifically at how the cozy gaming genre is defined and how it embraces some of these game structures that I've already discussed in chapters 2, 3, and 4. So for example, I talk about the game A Mortician's Tale, which is also about death and the memory of the dead ones in the living, and so on and so forth. So I look at how cozy gaming, by taking away certain aspects of what we would consider AAA or mainstream gaming, with focus on, guns and violence and death and those kinds of things, have made it more possible to examine the queer and feminist aspects of digital gaming without it being hid behind all the violence that could be and is indicative of traditional AAA gaming. It's in that chapter that I also introduce the concept of the feminist queer gesture, which essentially what I'm arguing with that is, by looking at the cozy game genre in the way that I have, what I've done is I've decentered the gaming industry expectations of quote unquote the player one expectation. So moving away from the white bodied, the able bodied, the middle to upper class, so on and so forth persona that is the audience that AAA or mainstream gaming caters to, but instead moving it towards those that might be an outlier to that player one persona. And then in chapter 6, I again expand this out to Bollock and Lemieux's idea of metagaming, which is a way to transform the play that we are experiencing in these games that I've highlighted and in the cozy game genre in particular, to create that critical emancipated player, one that can see the connections between these games and these particular mechanics and structures and their real life, and they're able to create some form of maybe behavioral change, maybe attitudinal change, something where the digital is no longer a separated, non-permeable magic circle, but instead can have real political and empathetic valency within a player's life if they're willing to see it. So yeah, that's kind of the overview of the book. I'm hoping to, as I move forward, I'm hoping to maybe explore that cozy gaming genre in a bit more detail from a feminist and queer perspective. But the role of play in people's lives is really what kind of informed this book and what it can mean for different folks, especially as you get into some of the books, or I'm sorry, some of the games that are maybe not as mainstream, or might be from indie developers that have a little bit more leeway and not as beholden to the idea of profit, pushing their narratives and their game development and that kind of stuff. So I tried to pay homage to those types of games in this book and those types of play experiences, because those are the ones that appeal to me and those are the ones that I can actually play. Because anymore it feels like some of these games you have to have started a long time ago to be able to know what all the buttons do and to coordinate your eyes and your hands and whatever apparatus you might use in order to play digital games. If you haven't started well before now, it's like you'll never catch up. So to be more inclusive and accessible, I think that hopefully this work ends up contributing to that realm of language. So that's what I got for you. That's all about the book. And I hope you enjoy it.
Thank you so much for that. Ooh, I still have this timer on. Let me turn that off. Thank you so much for that, Ashley. I learned so much from that presentation, and I know that everyone else here did. I wanted to shout out Megan Fleming, who said hello from Waverly, Iowa. So thanks for being here with us, Megan. Um, I guess I wanted to start out with a question for you about your epigraph, which you dedicate in part to everyone who doesn't feel like a real gamer. I really love that, and I was thinking about, well, of course, there's always been, non-men, people of color, queer people who are integral to video games. I guess in the spirit of gaming, I wanted to ask you like an either or both question. Um,
Sure.
I wanted to know if maybe you either wanted to talk a bit about your own journey in this kind of becoming a real gamer and or the ways in which women, trans folk, people of color, queer communities in gaming have become more mainstream.
Yeah. I'll start with the personal side of that. I started out with the original PlayStation. My brother had one. I mentioned this in the book. My brother had one. When he was away, I would play the PlayStation. And eventually, that translated into a Nintendo 64 and everything like that. Um, but I stopped playing for a long time and I didn't really start picking it back up again until I was in my young adulthood. And by that point, the controllers had changed so much with just all the buttons on the back and the thumbsticks and everything like that. It was hard for me to play, and I lost my joy coming back to that. And now I'm a PC gamer more than anything because I still can't get a controller in my hand that I feel comfortable with. But a keyboard and a mouse I feel a lot more comfortable with. So I loved video games, but I couldn't play them. And so I didn't feel like I was a gamer. I would watch other people play games, specifically my husband now. He will play some games that I just know I can't do. And so I'll watch him play those and then I play my own games on my computer. Um, I'm reclaiming that identity for myself, I guess, because now I feel like there's more and more available that isn't bound to that hardcore gamer lifestyle. Um, so that's kind of where that came from. Um, in terms of like the inclusivity, I think we are finally at that point where we're starting. The work is not done in any way, shape, or form, but we are starting to recognize that that player one persona is not dominant anymore. For the last several years, the Entertainment Software Association has been releasing their reports, and almost always when it comes in terms of gender, um, it's almost always split down the middle between those that identify as male and those that identify as female. And then when you add in, they do have a category for other, but as we know, sometimes people can't identify the way that they want to in surveys and that kind of stuff because we're not inclusive in that language. Um, I think it's pointing in the right direction. We aren't there at all yet. but it is nice to start to see more and more and more representation coming through on the player side. And hopefully, we'll start seeing a lot more representation on the content side of gaming too.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much for that. And I also wanted to say thank you to Amy Longfield, who in the chat said thank you. I'm excited to pick it up. Thanks so much for tuning in. And um, yeah, I know that you're gonna love this book. I guess I have another question for you, which I was thinking about when you were doing your presentation. I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about the difficulties about studying and writing about video games as an academic, and maybe on the flip side, some of the positives.
The magic is lost in some things, that's for sure. Knowing knowing kind of the how the industry works and the backgrounds of certain companies that work on games and things like that, it makes you a little bit more critical is the wrong word, but it can put a sour taste in your mouth, especially when some of the big studios start releasing games and you're like, this is just a reskin of a different game or,
Hmm.
something like that. But honestly, I didn't know you could do this until I was starting my master's. I didn't know that video games were worthy of being studied until then. And I started finding all this research. Skylar Rell Anderson, Adrian Shaw, Shira Chess, Mia Consalvo. I just started reading all of their stuff. And this was right when Gamergate was happening, or was like hardcore happening. And I think that kind of drove my motivation to be like, okay, this is what I want to study because this is something that has been in my life pretty much the whole time. Um, and I really think there's something here that can change the world. And then as the gaming industry grew and as it grew and became, it's the number one entertainment industry in the world. It's bigger than film and music combined when it comes to like profitability and dollars and things like that. So we have to pay attention to these kinds of things. They have cultural capital, they have political capital, and we're not recognizing it in that way yet. So that really pushes me to be like, okay, you're going to say, why do you study video games? But I'm going to turn around and be like, here's why, and here's why we need to pay attention.
Yeah, it's weird. I think just yeah, Gamergate obviously was just a really like kind of horrifying thing. But now with all this distance, it seems like it kind of opened up all these avenues for all this really good critical study, which I think is cool in retrospect. I actually have a lot of questions for you. I do want to ask you one from Megan Fleming, and they ask, was there one specific game or character that first sparked your interest in this topic, or where you noticed something was different than what was considered the norm?
I think it would have to be What Remains of Edith Finch or the Stanley Parable. I played those about the same time. And the Stanley Parable is much more explicit in how it's poking fun at digital games by the narrator speaking to you and responding to choices that you make. And at one point, even, creates mini metagames within the larger game itself. Like you find yourself in Minecraft suddenly at one point, and you have to stop the baby from catching on fire. If you play the game, you know what I'm talking about. But narrative wise, What Remains of Edith Finch, um, even though it's not a long game, it kind of left me in awe. And at that time, I was being introduced to the video game narrative framework, and I just started seeing all these connections. And I became an emancipated player essentially through that game and with that framework that was happening. And then I started looking at a bunch of other games that we had played, and I just kept seeing it everywhere. So I'm like, I need to write this down and I need to work on this. And that's kind of how it came about.
Yeah, apologies a bit for the hard swerve. I think I was just really excited about all the questions here to ask you. So if you did want to comment at all on that last thing, feel free to. Otherwise, I will ask you some more questions. Um, I do, yeah. I have a couple questions from one of our acquisitions editors, James Long. He asks if there are any online communities that you'd like to single out as being particularly welcome or inclusive.
Yeah. So Girls Make Games is a really great nonprofit organization that is incredibly supportive and inclusive of especially young folks that want to jump in on the gaming industry or learn about coding, even, or be able to write stories that lend themselves to that interactive feature. That one is really, really good. I also want to call out Able Gamers, which is, again, a nonprofit that makes it an inclusive experience for those who maybe do not have all of their appendages, or for those that have some form of intellectual disability or something like that, so that they can still be a part of um, the the gaming world, uh, even if they play in a non-traditional way. So those are two that um, I'm either a part of or I donate to, or things like that that I really want to call out.
Yeah, thanks for that. I've got another question from James. He'd like to know, and you mentioned this a little bit in your presentation, but um, maybe there are some more things you'd like to talk about. Are there any specific aspects of games that facilitate open-minded interactions?
Oh, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, there's lots. There's lots. What I present in this book is not exhaustive in any way, shape, or form at all. Um, you could go, nitty gritty with the details on this and just do a whole analysis on language. You could do a whole analysis on the development of certain games. I
Hmm.
mean, there's there's a lot you could do in this sense. I focus more specifically on aspects within a game, but there's lots that you can do inside and outside of digital games to do something similar with this framework too. Um, I think that simulators might be really interesting to kind of take on next. Why is Farming Simulator and Goat Simulator and Power Washing Simulator um, such an interesting and very highly played type of game? Um, I also think that, like I said earlier, the rise of a cozy game and what that actually means, because it has such a tight definition that a lot of people think casual games are cozy games. And that's not true. Cozy games have very specific things that you cannot include in order for it to be cozy, like dying, for example, which I think troubles our understanding of what qualifies a game as. Um, yeah, those are two areas that I'm particularly interested in.
It's so interesting to me as someone, I guess, who also maybe doesn't identify as like a real gamer, like how some of these kinds of games are kind of queer coded. Like I identify farming games as queer coded, but I don't know why I do, you know? Like it's just they just are to me for some reason. Um,
I think a lot of simulator games folks feel are at least not traditionally coded. So yeah, it's a fascinating area.
I have a question from Jenny Keegan, who is also one of our acquisition editors here, and she wanted to know maybe what you envision as the future for progressive games and gaming spaces. And she kind of had this comment that games from smaller gaming companies, like as you kind of mentioned, attained a lot of success, and also
Mm-hmm.
some studios, like do you say AAA? Is that how you say it?
Mm-hmm.
Studios? They have seen massive layoffs, so kind of with those things in mind.
Yeah, they have. I think so. It's twofold. I think that the gaming industry with the conglomeration, especially with like Microsoft game studios and that kind of stuff, buying up all of these, both small and large game development companies, I think that that's going to cause a problem, slash, is causing a problem already, even though they supposedly maintain their identities and their own workforces and things like that under the larger financial studio of Microsoft. Um, they're now owned by Microsoft, which means Microsoft can dictate a little bit more than what they would have been able to before. Which is why I do think we're seeing more and more indie game developers popping up and are doing really phenomenal work by bringing out new and novel rather than remake or a reskinned type of game that I think a lot of AAA developers are doing. So, I mean, um, look at the success of Claire Obscura. It's it's exploded and it's won so many awards and things like that. But it's also a really good lesson to think about when we consider the impact of AI in creative industries like this. They were excluded from the Indie Game Awards because there were portions of their code that was considered generative AI, and that's a big no no in some of these award categories and things like that. So, doing more with less is possible, but be careful how you go about doing that. But I'm really excited to see what comes out of the smaller developers, the indie developers, the one man developers, one person developers, I should say,
Mhm.
because there has been success. I think there will continue to be success. We just have to watch conglomeration and we have to watch generative AI.
Yeah, I guess this is the times that we live in. Um, I have another question from Jenny. She wanted to know, are there any trends on the business side of video games that you see as supporting or undermining political engagement and political action among gamers?
Yes. That's again a really good question. It can be a really big question. And again, a reason why I didn't focus, not that I didn't mention AAA games in the book, but they weren't the focus of the analyses. They were more, tertiary examples and that kind of stuff. But profit on a game that takes 7 years to make and multiple millions or billions even of dollars is the most important factor on the business side of things, which I think can impede on creativity. I think it can impede on the health, mental and physical, of the workers that are putting in their souls to these games. And that's why I think we're seeing that turn towards the indie accelerating at this point and being more successful and being more recognized because ultimately they're putting out the same quality of games, but they're putting them out under very different circumstances and situations. And the indies aren't the indies aren't you know firing people. The AAA's are, and part of that is I think they're burning them out. Um, there's always been what's called a blocked or leaky pipeline in the AAA digital game industry, which is where you can't get people of certain backgrounds, of certain ethnicities, of certain experiences into the digital gaming world because there's a lot of prejudice. They can't meet the hours requirements, maybe they have families, like that kind of stuff. Or if you do get in, and this is where the leaky pipeline comes in, they burn out or they decide this isn't what I want. And then we see all of these individuals leaving the AAA games and making their own indie game studios and having that success. So I could see a revolution coming potentially in how gaming developers structure themselves and move away from the financial security of big name organizations.
That was a really illuminating answer. Thank you for that. We have a traditional last question that we ask authors, which is, what are you working on next? You mentioned a bit about cozy gaming. Did you want to speak a little more about that or tell us about any other upcoming projects?
Yeah, I've got two projects in the works right now. One of them is pretty much written but needs to be updated a little bit, and that is um, looking at how do I want to say it? Looking at the ephemerality of games like The Vanishing of Ethan Carter and Tacoma, um, and oh, what's the other game that I focus on there? I can't remember what the other game is, but looking at how ephemerality plays a major part of creating a queer experience within a game. So glitch aesthetics, um, glitch procedures, that kind of stuff. So that one is, I'd say, 90% written and ready to go, and that's hopefully going to be a chapter or a journal article or something like that. And then, yeah, I think for the next big project, like I said, I want to turn towards that cozy gaming genre. There's a lot more research that's starting to get published on that, so I need to hop on it.
Mhm.
But um, I think examining the cozy aspects of gaming from a feminist and queer procedure would be a really interesting standpoint.
Yeah, those both sound fascinating and I like the shift from like the design to like the kind of experience and the aesthetics.
Mm-hmm.
I yeah, looking forward to that and that's all that we have today. I just wanted to thank you one more time for being with us and for such a great and illuminating presentation. And I also wanted to thank everyone in the chat for tuning in. Just a reminder that you can get Ashley's book with a 40% off discount, which is in the chat. So make sure to get that. And before we go, is there anything else that you'd like to say, Ashley?
Thanks so much for coming to the talk. Thanks for all your comments and likes and things like that. And thank you to LSU Press for hosting me.
All right, until next Wednesday, thank you all.